This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we will be talking about well-being science, from despair to hope and happiness. My guest is Dr. Carol Graham. She's been on before, and I'm so thrilled to welcome her back again. Carol Graham, who is a distinguished senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at Brookings, a College Park professor at the University of Maryland, and a senior scientist at Gallup. She is an expert in well-being economics and has authored influential books such as The Power of Hope: How Well-Being Science Can Save Us from Despair, and Happiness for All: Unequal Lives and Hopes in Pursuit of the American Dream. Her extensive research explores the links between well-being, inequality, and economic development, with publications in leading journals like Science and Health Affairs. Carol, thank you so much for coming back, particularly at this time. We need this conversation.
Thanks for having me, and look forward to the conversation making me a bit more hopeful than I am at the moment. I'm trying, but yes.
These are hard times. These are hard times for not just Americans, for everyone around the world is feeling a bit, not everyone, many people are feeling a bit of despair with the state of affairs at the moment.
I mean, I think we have to recognize this isn't so much about happiness, but we have to recognize that the U.S. has been a leader of all the things we've always stood for: freedom, health, like health innovations, democracy, even, foreign assistance. All these things are just falling apart. And yes, the world is wondering what we're doing. And I guess so are we.
So are we. Let's talk about the concept, though, of the happy peasant and the miserable millionaire paradox, because I think what we're seeing now is illustrative of this.
In the extreme, what I think is going on is people essentially, including people in positions of power now, both in the government administration, but also even in the news media, choosing to pursue money and more money and sort of sustainability of their businesses, and just forsaking other principles that we care a lot about, like take democratic freedom and going back to happiness. One of the most important determinants of happiness is freedom, right? Having freedom in your life. We now have seen the Washington Post, one of our figurehead newspapers, or, banner newspapers, national newspapers, succumb to some kind of pressure, and the opinion page is now supposed to only talk about free markets. That's just, we couldn't have imagined this before, right? Yeah. But so when we think about what determines well-being or happiness, money does matter. So there's the paradox of miserable millionaires and happy peasants has to do with extremes more than people need a certain amount of means to survive. People who are destitute tend to not. Of course, they're going to have low life satisfaction scores because they're living their life day to day, trying to make it and not starve or, be able to feed their families. But once you get past a certain point, you get something like the paradox of happy peasants and miserable millionaires, which is more and more money does not end up with more and more happiness. That, different countries have what we call a satiation point, where the relationship between income and life satisfaction. Happiness is kind of too big a catch-all term. So let's stick to life satisfaction, which is, it's a more focused question about how satisfied are you with your life that tracks closely with how happy are you with your life, but they're happy. It can be momentary and long-term. Life satisfaction is always like it's an evaluative concept about your whole life. So what we find is that up to a certain point, more income results in higher levels of life satisfaction. Because if you think about being satisfied with your life, part of it is being able to choose what you want to do in life. You can run a cool podcast like you, or you can do work on well-being like I can, or you can't make choices in your life, and your scores are going to be very different, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about that, sufficient income is also very necessary to healthcare, particularly in this country. Other countries in the world, even poor countries, I'm originally from Peru, have a national health system, which may not be perfect, but if you lose your job, you're not worried that, your family's going to not have health care. In this country, that's very much the case.
Yes.
So, and then we find that as people get wealthier and wealthier, not only do they not get happier, but in some surveys, and there's some debate over this, but in some surveys, there's sort of an S in that relationship. So let me explain it. If you look at a graph between income and life satisfaction, what you get is a concave, a curve that doesn't keep going up. It's not linear. So it goes up when people are very poor, more money, increases in life satisfaction. And then it kind of flattens out, because after people have sufficient means, other things start, they can worry about other things. They can take satisfaction in other things. They can worry about freedom. They can worry about having a better job, not better in terms of money, but a job that they care about. They worry much more about purpose and meaning in their life, because they can't, right? They're not scrambling to feed,
right,
starving babies.
Survival is taken off the table. They have enough to survive. So now we're moving to the next level.
It's a little bit, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but then it tapers off, except for a very small little tail of very wealthy people where it goes up. And it's those people who seem to get an additional boost with more money after they have way too much money already. And if you think about that, again, you can't find that in every survey. You need only rich country surveys where people are wealthy enough to be in that position, and it may vary a bit by country. But if you think about, or not just think about it, I've done some empirical research showing that if you look at populations not by the distribution of income, a lot of work focuses on, okay, what determines the happiness of low-income people, of middle-income people, of high-income people? Does it differ? It doesn't differ that much. But if you look at the distribution of happiness, so you divide the population you're looking at into what we call quantiles, so quarters of the happiness distribution. Turns out the happiest people care least about money, so they need less money to be happy. They care much more about creativity and learning, right?
Yes.
They're probably people like us. And then the least happy people care most about money and need more money to make them happy. So when you think about the paradox of happy peasants and miserable millionaires, you're sort of seeing that, right? So here you have people with less money that don't really feel a strong need for more money, or they're not, and I'll explain that a little bit more, that part of it. But you see some people very high up in the income distribution that seem to gain from even more money, after they've certainly passed any kind of, way beyond any sufficiency point. They have tons of money, and we have plenty of them in our country.
Oh, there are plenty of them. So you're saying they're reporting that they have even more happiness? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. As they get even wealthier, they have small gains in their happiness.
Wow.
So rather than the curve just being, kind of tapering off, there's a little teeny tail of respondents at the very top of the income distribution that have boosts in happiness from more money. At the bottom end, it gets a little more complicated, because very poor people, and I began my work as a development economist and worked in Peru and lots of other, poor communities in very poor countries. And very poor people sort of adapt to what they can have, right? So their expectations are lower. And so while, we worry about nicer houses or bigger cars, they kind of take pleasure in the fact that they were able to make it through the week and feed their families and have a Sunday lunch. It's a whole, or they will take great pleasure in, being able to, they often start in, shanty towns where they have houses, with straw matting and dirt floors, and they take great pleasure in collecting bricks so they can build the next stage of their house, so their expectations are lower. So you do have to put a kind of contextual picture on all of this. And some of the low expectations stuff can be negative. It could be adapting your expectations downward could be negative in the sense you'll put up with things you wouldn't put up with like a lot of corruption or, a bad job or whatever it might be, or poor health. Poor people, a lot of surveys say, oh, the poor don't get sick that much, because you ask them, how many days did you miss last month because of poor health? Well, they go to work with poor health because they can't afford not to, right? So that's the negative side of it. The positive side of it is it's a psychological coping mechanism, So it's a little more complicated in very poor contexts, and it's a little bit why I called it happy peasants, because it tends to be not urban people who are kind of coming out of poverty, low income urban people, because their expectations are already higher because they see how the rest of the world around them lives. Poor rural people often, now with social media, it's probably changed a bit, but poor people in remote places are less aware of how the rest of the world lives. Again, that's changing a bit with media, but so that matters a lot. Versus in the US, for example, our poor are very well aware of how the rich live.
And I also think about like becoming de-incentivized, right? If you're feeling stuck and trapped that there's no place to go, right? You're at the lower end of the income spectrum, or poverty, below poverty even. Where is hope in the equation? That's, I guess, when we're talking about hope in the context.
That's a tough question. So, for example, when I introduce the approach to students or kind of audiences that don't know anything about well-being measurement, I talk about one reason we've developed these metrics is when there's so many measures out there. Why would you develop new measures, right? Well, the reason is they're capturing very different things, much more relevant to human behavior and human expectations that actually determine the way people act. So take two examples. One is somebody from a lower caste in India who's essentially has no hope of really ever getting out of that, because it's kind of a life. It's changed.
Maybe the next life. In terms of
not
being
in this life, right? Yeah. You're sort of, you got a thing on your head stamped that says you're going to be in that position. So they may behave in a way that we would think is lacking incentive, but it may just be how they're coping with the reality they have, right? They can't really change it, short of, extreme behavior versus.
Well, I was just going to say, but the hopefulness is that the next time it will be better. So because of their belief structure, religion, they believe it will get better, and they're willing to either settle or accept. I'm talking about it like in Indian caste society, what is now.
Right. What's interesting, though, there have been some experiments that show that some of that can be changed. So, for example, there have been some experiments in Indian schools, just like where in one school they had everybody identified the students as what caste they were, which is typical. In the next school, again, experimental setting, they didn't do that. And it turns out that the lower caste kids performed better in class, in the non-identified class, because that stigma was kind of removed.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine, because I think about also if hope and optimism are different things. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. So I think when you're talking about people in lower castes thinking the next life will be better, I think that's more optimism than hope. Hope really has an agentic property, which is it's not just the belief that things will get better. It's the belief that you can make them better. So in my book, for example, there's a quote from Amanda Gorman, the poet, the inaugural poet, that says, for the last chapter, it says, hope is not a promise we give, it's a promise we live. And so,
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It means people believe they can make their lives better. So with what the experiment did, that I'm citing, an age-old experiment, it showed that if you remove the stigma and the discrimination that's sort of a barrier to kids doing better, they do better. Go figure, right? And so I think the hope is more likely hope rather than optimism in situations where they're kind of somehow released from that. And I don't know India that well, but I'm assuming that over time, some of that caste structure has loosened a bit. Probably not completely, not completely.
It's been decades since I've been to India. It was like 20 years ago, and that was very much a part still of culture, although the middle class was the fastest growing in the world at that time. I'm sure things have changed. Everything has changed. But this notion of hope and despair.
Information has changed too, which changes, that in and of itself can be a way to break barriers. After a while, if people know enough, they start challenging what this structure that's been imposed on them, right? It's not easy.
We can only hope.
Yeah. Well, so yes, exactly. In many ways, it applies to other countries too. But kind of related to that, there was another experiment also it was in a poor state in India. And it was cash transfer programs that give poor people cash instead of some tied aid. And, the initial concern about it was, they're just going to spend it on bad stuff. Well, it's, guess what? Parents spend their money on their children.
Yes.
That's usually, especially if you give it to the mothers. But, in any event, so they gave people a cow, like poor households, a cow. And you would think, what is that? But that was an asset. And you know what the main result of the cash transfer experiment was? Increases in hope among the households that got a cow, because they saw this asset as something they could use to make their own lives better, right? They didn't kill the cow and eat it right away. They knew that if
the cow is sacred. So
yeah, exactly. But it was also just the idea that this could be something that allowed them to benefit and flourish in, over time. And so I think that's part of the hope. And, the optimism is, as I mentioned, a psychological preservation mechanism that's, I think, very important for people that have no choice. But I think the biggest way to give people hope, or to cultivate hope. You can't really give people hope, but to cultivate hope is to show them pathways to make their lives better, to create pathways, to show them pathways. And right now, I'm really focused on switching context totally on the teen mental health crisis here.
We are going to take a break. And when we come back, we are going to explore the teen mental health crisis with my guest today, Carol Graham. She is the author of The Power of Hope, How the Science of Well-Being Can Save Us from Despair. To learn more, you can find Carol on X at CG Brookings, on LinkedIn at Carol Graham, and at the Brookings at brookings.edu/people, Carol Graham. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Harvesting Happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back, continuing the conversation with my guest today, Dr. Carol Graham. We're talking about well-being science, from despair to hope and happiness. Let's return to the conversation. Okay, let's talk about the teens in today's society and the mental health crisis, because it is pervasive. I have young adult kids. Your kids are older, but I hear from friends with teenage kids.
But they are young adults. My twins are in their early 20s, so yeah, it relates.
Mine too.
So let me just tell you quickly go over some background information that really highlights how surprising this is. So over time, many of us economists studying well-being, since we started at this in about 2020, have found that pretty much all over the world, with the exception of very poor, very violent countries where it's really difficult to age, or people don't even make it to old age, that there is a U-shaped curve between life satisfaction and age, so that people start in the traditional curve, the U curve. They start off when they're young, 18 to 25, 30, happier, and then they have a sort of a midlife dip. I wouldn't say midlife crisis, but a midlife dip, which I'll explain in a second. And then after a certain point, they get happier as they get older, until they get till about age 75 and up, some longer, some older, still don't taper off. But because after that, people's health often deteriorates, their friends die, whatever. But until about 75, 80, you get this U. And so the midlife dip is explained by it's not explained by, some guaranteed crisis. It's explained by realities. We've all, been there, where you have young kids, older parents. You're trying to, really establish your career by then. If you haven't, you really kind of need to. If you can't sing and play guitar, you probably need to give up on being a rock star. That can be a tough thing. And then psychiatrists kind of supplement the factors we identify in sort of as structural life factors, workplace, all kind of aging, all sorts of things. But they supplement it with work on emotional wisdom. And their point is that as you get older, you get emotionally wiser. And so I describe it as, between the young and the old, the standard deviation of bad experiences is much higher for the young. So, when you have a young teen who has a bad thing, whether they fail a test or break up with a boyfriend, girlfriend, they haven't had something like this before, at least not the average ones. And it seems like the end of the world. By the time you get older, you've had so many hard knocks, unless they're really serious, they kind of roll off your back. I mean, you have like a bad day or two and then you get over it, right? Because, in most instances, life will keep going. It might even get better, right? So,
there's hope. There's hope in that, embedded hope in that process.
Exactly. Absolutely. But then now what we're finding, it's really daunting, is that in the US now and a few other wealthy countries, it's the youngest that are the least happy and the oldest that are the happiest. So there's no more you. There's a linear line up. Oof. With age.
Wow. And that's been since when? What years did that?
The decline in teen mental health began in about 2012, 2013. A lot of people blame social media,
Yeah.
but I think social media exacerbated existing trends. And so let me explain very quickly. So and then it was exacerbated yet again by COVID. But I think it was
Yes.
either caused by social media or COVID. Those were exacerbating factors. What it is kids are having a much harder time finding hope, right? Pathways to college and other forms of higher education are unaffordable for most people. And even more so now with changes in policies and everything else, unless, you're lucky enough to get financial aid or whatever, and that's harder to do now. And then labor markets are very uncertain. Have, AIs coming down the pike, already low skill jobs are essentially gone. And so unless you have either a college degree or some form of higher education, it could be vocational training, it could be, you don't have the skills to thrive in tomorrow's labor markets. And that's obviously very relevant for young adults, right? And the other thing is our traditional curriculum. They're very good with things like learning facts and algebra and whatever, but they're not very good until you get to college at sort of imparting critical thinking. And then, particularly in the US, we shy away from things like socio-emotional skills. And yet, to navigate today and tomorrow's world and labor markets, you're going to need creativity, adaptability, self-esteem, sort of how do you combat bullies, all this stuff that kids aren't exposed to early enough. So you have poor kids that just don't get those skills. And then you have rich kids who are helicopter parented. And when they hit some barriers later on, when
they decompensate, they can't manage. Yeah. But what's interesting is it's almost by design, right? If you dumb down the population, then people fall in. I think that for me, that's what makes me very upset about what I see around me, that, they don't teach civics in school. They don't teach emotional and social learning in most schools. Some do, but very few. And so you have people that come into the world and grow up and don't have a clue as to how government runs or how to problem solve. And so then
civic education is terribly low. But on the socio-emotional skills, there's also something that a colleague of mine, Bob Lighton, who was at Brookings forever, he's a lawyer and an economist, but he was very involved in something called it's called Beyond the Debate, and there's a PBS special on it, where they said, one of the things missing in schools, which requires having knowledge of civic education and also being able to listen to others, are debating clubs.
Yes.
A debate.
I had it.
You can't
Did you have it? Did you have it in school? I had it in my school when I was young.
Yeah. You had to, those don't barely exist anymore. Yeah. And yet, think about our society now. Nobody's listening to the other side.
Yeah.
To win a debate, you have to listen to the other side. Yeah. You need to be able to respond to the other side's argument to win the debate. Or you're toast. So that is imparting a skill that will be incredibly useful, but kids tend to not have it. They've spent too much time stressing out about very structured exams. I mean, all those things matter, but it just seems like
that may be by design, right? Like because it reorders what society produces for the workforce. It educates people to just do the job, not question, not have discernment.
The problem is if you don't have a college degree, you end up getting stuck in bad jobs, which tend to lack health insurance and all sorts of other things. You have no control over your schedule, right? You're a robot.
Yeah.
You're right. There's an amazing book about Amazon taking over all these, industries, and it's called Fulfillment, the One-Click Society, and it's by a guy called Matt Gilman, I think. But in any event, it shows how Amazon dehumanized entire industries, right? And balkanized, because the workers, they've tried to organize unions.
Yes.
And that's been tough to do. I'm really glad and proud of the young people trying to organize unions in places like Amazon or Starbucks, but they're not welcome and they know it, It's kind of fighting uphill because they don't want workers to have a voice. They're very happy to have you be dumbed down.
And yet that's where hope lives, right? Where we do something to try and make a difference. I think that's an incubator for hope. We're almost out of time. So I want to make sure that we end with a good challenge on an uplifting note, that like by going out in the world and maybe doing the thing that's not popular, but that's the right thing, that's where we find hope and possibility. I don't know. You're the expert on this subject.
I totally agree with you. And I think in today's times, which one feels hopeless.
Yeah.
We are already seeing people standing up and going, wait a minute.
What is going on here?
What is going on? And I do think there's hope in new awareness. I think, everything we can do to just help the public understand what's going on and that there are pathways to changing things, to express their voices is really important.
And we do it through our pockets. We do it through voting. We do it through civic engagement in our communities, community service. I mean, to me, this is where hope lives, right? Like helping somebody else, getting out of your own way. And for some people, it's through spiritual practice, although it need not be, because those other activities can be spiritual practice for some.
They're spiritual in their own way.
Yep.
And in a much more proactive way. Yeah. Because you're no, I actually think, and one of the things I'm seeing already with education innovations, because I've been looking at lots of them and starting to write about them, is that they're bottom up things. Are happening in schools, they're happening in communities and the UK has an amazing number of them, where they are now changing school curriculum to incorporate these skills, where they include parents and community in what they're doing in the schools, so nobody feels that they've been imposed upon. And they even take surveys of the kids before they design their interventions, so they've heard the kids' voices too. And it's something that we need to be doing more of. And in the same way, debating or other ways we can encourage kids to sort of take control even of their lives in the classroom, to be active and not passive learners is a hope creating thing.
Well, and that inclusivity, right, where the parents are involved, also helps raise all ships, right? It's not just the children, but then you're impacting the parents and the community and the Rizar, right? That's the ripple effect when you throw a stone, right? Breeds hope. We're out of time, so we have to have a hard stop, but we're going to do more because this subject is really important right now when people are having such a hard time with hopefulness and happiness. To learn more about Carol Graham's work, please go on X to CG Brookings, on LinkedIn at Carol Graham, and at brookings.edu. You can find Dr. Carol Graham's work there. The book we're talking about today is The Power of Hope, How the Science of Well-Being Can Save Us from Despair. Carol, you and I have got to have a lot more conversations.
So we've got to keep at it.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dr. Carol Graham, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guest, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.